Welcome to the third ever episode of the Grid Buzz podcast, where we will be doing our first ever Imola GP race review. Imola was honestly a really good race this weekend. Really good race this weekend, which is maybe not super common for Imola. Some people joke about Imola being Monaco on a circuit because the track's not that wide. It doesn't allow that much opportunity for overtaking. Wherever you qualify is a lot of times where you may finish. I've seen, quite a bit of speculation saying that one of the reasons that they think the race was better this year was the fact that it was not a one-stop race, the fact that it turned into a two-stop race because of the softer compounds running the C6, the C5, and the C4, which, unfortunately means the C6 was basically useless in GP format because it was so soft. It seemed like it was barely even hanging on for qualifying. I mean, we saw that with the Aston Martins and even George Russell putting really good times in with the medium compound in Q3 and in Q2, which is not something that you typically would see. Normally there's quite a bit of a pace difference between the C6 and the C5, and you didn't really see that in this instance. But it also meant that the C6 just went away super quick and was basically useless for the GP, which is why, you saw no one run the C6 even after the late race full safety car, where I think in normal circumstances, had the compounds been a little bit harder, you would have seen more people throw on the soft. So I know it would have been interesting if this would have still been a two-stop if it wasn't for the VSC in the full safety car. I'm not sure if it was totally compound related that made this a two-stop race. It's probably a mix of both, but regardless, it did make it a two-stop race for most people, and that made things quite a bit more interesting. A lot of passes on track, a lot of passes down into turn one on the back of the DRS zone, which made this super interesting and made for some really good highlight clips. And with that, the highlight clip of the race, probably of the last few years, turn one, lap one, Max Verstappen. What an absolute send that was. To be honest, I don't think Piastri knew that was coming. I don't think most people knew that was coming. Off the line, Piastri got a pretty good start. Max's start was not as good, which has been interesting, actually. Typically, Max has been known for having really good starts. I mean, think back last season when, it was him and Norris battling. Norris was the one not getting good starts, and Max was the one who was, capitalizing on good starts and passing into turn one or being able to hold off into turn one. We've actually seen Piastri more often be the one to have better starts this year. He definitely had a better start this race. He had a better start into, what was that, Bahrain, where he sent it up the inside of Max, I believe. But yeah, Max, another kind of average start. But then what really helped him here, I think, was Russell had a pretty blinding fast start, even behind Piastri, had the best start of the three. Max's start not being as good made Piastri kind of move to the inside and defend against George a little bit more. To be fair, when you look at these shots, like Max is so far back, you really don't think he has a shot at a lunge here, but he lunges from way back, kind of catches Piastri out, gets up the inside for turn two, and then is able to hold that and kind of force his way onto the racing line and hold that and really take off with it. So what an absolute send by Max. Highlight reel overtake probably of the season so far. Just Max doing typical Max things and really capitalizing on, any sort of weakness or mistake or open window or opportunity, which is what makes him, the driver that he is. Moving over, another lap one event, which didn't pan out so well for Gasly, was a couple corners later. Leclerc's coming up the inside of Gasly. Gasly's really trying to kind of fight for the position. I think he, tries to fight for it a bit too hard, obviously. Probably should have, kind of let it happen. It was a Ferrari versus an Alpine, probably not something that he was going to be able to defend against long term. And he ended up washing wide because he tried to fight Leclerc too hard, ends up, off the track into the grass a little bit, and ends up giving up a few positions as a result and really messing up his race start. So Gasly maybe could have been a little bit smarter. I mean, I understand you want to hold the positions, you want to hold people behind you, but he was fighting a little bit too hard, I think, against a car that even though Ferrari is maybe not the Ferrari it's been in past years and has been a little bit slower this year, the Alpine hasn't been that great either. And so I don't think that was a smart move by Gasly. Fast forward a little bit into Russell starts to slow down and creates a DRS train of cars. And this is one of the first times that I've seen Ferrari actually make a pretty good strategy call. It's actually not first time. They've actually been, pretty decent on strategy this year, to be fair. But for those of you who have followed the sport for a while, especially those of you who are Ferrari fans, Ferrari likes to Ferrari with their pit stop strategy, their pit stops, anything to do with strategy tends to go a little haywire, which they have cleaned up a little bit this year. To be fair, it's actually been pretty good, but their car, unfortunately, has also slowed down in tandem with that, at least in qualifying. Their race pace does, once again, actually look pretty good at most races, but their qualifying has put them on the back foot a bit, which is the opposite of a couple years ago when, their qualifying pace was really good, especially in the hands of Leclerc, often, securing pole position over Verstappen. But then, when the race gets going, they just did not have the pace to keep him behind. This is kind of the opposite this year. Their qualifying pace is not great, but their race pace is actually pretty solid. But going back to the strategy, Russell kind of not having the best race pace the last couple races, and this one especially, backing a bunch of cars up into each other, creating a DRS train, letting the people out front kind of just run away with it. Leclerc was, mentioning that his tires, and to be fair, a lot of people in the field were mentioning how their tires were starting to go away fairly early. Now, it turned out the people who stayed out, the tires kind of came back into the window again, and they were able to extend, I think, a lot longer than they thought. But given the information that they had at the time, they did decide to pit, given the tires were starting to go away a little bit, it appeared. And then also they were losing a ton of time behind that, that DRS train. And so this allowed Leclerc to go for the undercut. Unfortunately, though, Leclerc being, probably the second most unlucky driver on the grid the last few years, the unluckiest, probably being Alonso, the VSC comes out and totally ruins that strategy call. Not only because they decided to repit Leclerc for, hards and try to extend for quite a long time at that point on that tire, but also because he lost track position at that point. So everything that he had done kind of, on the undercut and the opportunity that he opened up for himself, he ended up giving up a lot of that track position as a result and kind of reshuffling himself back down into the order. I think this is a little bit of a hindsight bias, obviously, but knowing everything that happened, I would have liked to see them actually not pit Leclerc during the VSC. I understand why they pitted him. You get to save 10 seconds on a pit stop. You don't know if that's going to happen again or how everything's going to play out, but I think it was, almost throwing away a set of tires and reshuffling yourself back down the order after you had made a lot of progress on that undercut. I would have actually liked to see him stay out a little bit longer, extend, wait for another safety car to happen, potentially, which did, ironically happen at the end of the race, or at minimum, even if the safety car didn't happen, just extend out on those tires longer, throw on a new compound later and be able to, not have to extend that one compound so long and be able to drive a bit faster, potentially have a tire advantage, all of those things. So I do think on the strategy, while the early pit stop made sense, pitting under the VSC, maybe this is hindsight bias, but like I said, I think there's a couple scenarios that could have played out where I would have liked to see them extend and not pit during that VSC. But, it is what it is. On the back of that ending, Piastri obviously did pit as well and took advantage of that. I do think that, Piastri made his way back through the pack pretty quick. He did have traffic that could have caused a lot bigger issues than it did. Obviously, it did cause some issues, allowing, Norris to kind of close back in on the gap and all of that during the next pit cycle window. But Yuki, that mistake in the last corner heading into the DRS zone, it's just not the kind of mistake that you want to see. Like, you would like to see Yuki be able to defend a little bit harder against Piastri. Now, Piastri was on fresh tires and all of that, but you would have liked to see him be able to hold him up more than he did, and allow Max to have just a bigger gap and give him a better shot at victory. Now, at the end of the day, it didn't actually end up mattering, so it's okay. But Yuki making a mistake on that specific corner, or going in and not being able to hold Piastri back for at least another lap, I do think was a pretty big drop on Yuki's behalf. That's in addition to Yuki wadding it up in Q1 of qualifying. Ends up kind of saving it, gets in the top 10, gets some points, but a lot of that was some luck due to the VSC and the full safety car kind of allowing him back in. And then, Fernando's comment on the back of Leclerc being the probably second most unlucky driver in the world. The other one who got really caught out on safety cars was Fernando Alonso. Super unfortunate for him. Looked like it was the potential for a decent place by him this race. Get some points for him. It's a little bit ironic that Stroll, who is often seen as one of the worst drivers on the grid, maybe gets a little bit more heat than he deserves, but to see him with some points this season, and Fernando still just with a big fat goose egg is unfortunate. Now Fernando has been caught out a lot this season with just super unfortunate events, which has led to him not scoring points. On the flip side, Stroll has kind of gotten lucky in a few races, been able to capitalize on that luck though. So I don't know if you call that luck or not at that point, but Fernando really kind of expressing his feelings over the team radio, calling himself out as the most unlucky driver in the world was a bit of a funny race moment. Moving on later into the race, this is where, did Ferrari make another Ferrari moment? So like I said, I think they made a pretty good decision strategy-wise at the beginning of the race. I don't think that they made as good of a strategy decision, maybe some hindsight bias on pitting during the VSC. And then really where they didn't make potentially a great decision was not allowing Leclerc to go on softs under the safety car. Now, once again, maybe a little bit of hindsight bias here because it's really hard to say. The 6 was a pretty soft compound. They did make a good call out that like 17 laps on this compound is probably going to be pretty tough, maybe impossible. I would probably agree that is true given how soft of a compound it is and how much it didn't hold up in qualifying. But it was 17 laps at the point that the safety car was deployed, and maybe the safety car lasted longer than I think a lot of people expected it to last. But you have to think that the safety car is probably going to last at least a couple laps until the restart. So maybe it goes from 17 to at least under 15, maybe like 14 or 13. In reality, it ended up going down to 10. And I would like to think that the C6 compound probably could have lasted for 10 laps. No one tried it, so it's really hard to say what would have really happened there. But at the end of the day, leaving him on those super old hard compound tires just did not work at all. Had they once again, maybe waited to pit a little bit later so that he was on fresher hard compounds, or do it during the full safety car or whatever, this could have panned out a lot better. But unfortunately, maybe Ferrari having a little bit of a Ferrari moment, keeping him on those old hard compounds, and he was just essentially a sitting duck at that moment. On the restart, he actually did pretty decent for the first couple corners. He did call out, heading into it, that he was worried about getting that hard compound of tire fired back up. I actually don't think that necessarily happened. It did seem like he got it fired up pretty quick, because through the first couple corners, he didn't struggle on the restart. He started to struggle a lap in, though, I think, when the tire started to really get some heat into him. And then he was just that sitting duck. Albon was all over the back of him. Obviously they had the moment where Albon kind of dive bombed on the outside and did beat him to the apex. As much as I hate to say that, at first when I watched it, I was like, why are they giving that position back up? There's been so many moments of this happening throughout the year, and people didn't give it up, or they were awarded it, or whatever. And so I was a little bit upset at first to see them give it back up, but after I rewatched some onboards and some replays and some different angles, he was definitely ahead at the apex. And the fact that there was just recently a full safety car meant that the field was bunched up, and having something like the precedence would have been a 10-second penalty, because that's what it's been for other instances other than the lap 1 Max incident, which was 5. 10 seconds would have set him back quite a bit, and realistically he wasn't going to hold off Albon anyway. Like, Albon was getting through. So while I was upset about handing that place back at first, I do think that was the right decision for a number of instances. Unfortunately, Albon getting caught a little bit out, because by Charles doing that, it did put him off the track and allow Hamilton up the inside. So even though Charles had to give it back, I guess it was kind of an unintentional win for Ferrari. So we'll take that. Back to the actual safety car restart though. One other shout out on Max is Max always seems to just leave the pack behind on these VSC restarts or these safety car restarts. Like, I don't know how people just like haven't caught on to it or, caught up with it or whatever, but whether he be in P2, P3 and he's the one restarting behind the leader, or whether he's P1 and doing the restart himself, he always seems to either walk away with the restart, or if he's behind, be really on it for the person who is kind of taking off with the restart. And so it is interesting to see, these safety car restarts and, the strategy that Max deploys every time, and, how he just seems to be the absolute king of these restarts. So I did think that was interesting heading into the end of the race, seeing whether the McLaren were going to be able to kind of bring the fight to him. But between, Max's really solid restart, Piastri being on, some older worn down tires, and, maybe holding up Lando a little bit, Lando calling out that, on the team radio, in a way saying, I'm not asking him to let me by, but, if we want to take the fight to Max, like, Piastri's tires are shot, you should consider letting me by. I didn't really understand what that meant, because he was basically asking for a team order while also saying, I'm not telling him to let me by. So I don't really know what that means. I'm pretty sure, he was fishing to get a team order to let him by, but I don't know why he covered it up with trying to pretend like he wasn't. So felt like that was an interesting take. That being said, it probably would have been the good team order. It's hard though, because Piastri's in the lead of the world championship. So it's hard to make a team order like that. But at the end of the day, it did hurt Lando a little bit. Max was able to walk away and obviously bring home the victory, which was great. Going back to another interesting overtake though, after the safety car restart, while I do think Yuki made a mistake earlier not holding up Piastri a bit more, Yuki did pull a pretty nice switchback on Hulkenberg. So, coming down the outside, having Hulkenberg dive to the inside to kind of cover him off. And then that caused Hulkenberg to kind of miss his braking point in the corner, swing wide. And then Yuki pulled a nice little switchback underneath him. I did think that was a pretty solid overtake by Yuki. So good on him there. Moving into Piastri, we've talked about, Leclerc being unlucky in, the last few years. I think Piastri also has been pretty unlucky this year. He had the safety car virtual safety car that, gave Norris an advantage back in the Miami sprint. Piastri should have won that race, but unfortunately because of that, he didn't. And then once again here, these VSCs and safety cars, came at pretty poor times for Piastri, leaving him on older compounds of tire, causing him to kind of lose the gap that he had created throughout the race and giving Norris a bit of an advantage. So that is unfortunate for Piastri that he's lost some positions, even lost a sprint because of VSCs and safety cars this year. So, maybe putting him on a similar plane as Leclerc, but not too lucky. Piastri on the flip side, at least, has capitalized very well in races this season and has really maximized his points where he could, but those have definitely put him on the back foot a little bit, and to be honest, saved Norris a few times. It seems like Norris has been saved a few times in the last few years over safety cars and virtual safety cars, having been, winning the Miami sprint this year on a safety car, winning his first ever race in Miami last year, basically on a safety car. So, it seems like he's the lucky one and Piastri's the unlucky one in this equation, but it is what it is. And, that's how it panned out. Overall, though, a really, really good Imola GP. Super interesting. A lot of good overtakes, a lot of good little highlight reels. A lot of passes, honestly, into turn one on the back of the DRS zone. A couple instances of cars going side by side, a lot of the type of battles that you want to see, and things that you don't see a lot in this generation of F1, with the cars being a lot heavier, a lot bigger, and oftentimes making it hard to go side by side and battle like this on these narrower tracks, especially. Looking at the top 10 too, we got Max, Lando, Piastri, Lewis at P4. Now I do think that Lewis got a little bit lucky here. If I had to say, some of the safety cars were well timed for him, but overall, like, he capitalized. I think if it was a couple laps longer, he probably could have taken the fight to Oscar Piastri, who was really struggling on the race. Same thing, honestly, with Albon, who finished P5. Had he not had that Leclerc incident, got by, obviously he probably would have held P4 against Lewis with the pace he had. Maybe Lewis could have came and caught him, but he might have even had the chance to also go fight Oscar Piastri. So, really, really interesting how that would have played out had we had another couple laps. It'd be interesting if F1 extended races by the number of laps that we were under safety car. That could have made the end of this race super interesting, having some bonus laps. Now I realize that that's pretty hard, basically impossible, given that we don't refuel anymore and teams only put the amount of fuel that you need for the race in the car, so you can't really extend like you can in Formula E, but could have added some interesting dynamic to the race. I think we would have gotten some good fighting had it been a couple laps longer. And you got Leclerc in sixth, which is super unfortunate. Like we've talked about a lot on this episode, really caught out poorly by the VSC and the full safety car, and being on a pretty old set of hard compound tires, not being able to defend. George Russell just having another race of just absolutely falling away in terms of race pace after being pretty good in qualifying, which was interesting because it wasn't super hot this weekend. So it made sense that Mercedes didn't do well last weekend in Miami because of the heat, and their car typically doesn't do well in the heat but does well in the cold. We didn't have that same level of heat in Imola this year, so a bit interesting to see, Russell's race pace not be there as much as it was, but that's how the cards kind of fell for Mercedes this weekend, on top of Antonelli having a power unit issue and DNFing from the race. And then we've got, Carlos Sainz in the top 10, the Williams looking really hot the last two GPs, placing really well, scoring points, outperforming Ferrari in a couple ways, which is very interesting to see. A team like Williams that was basically nowhere a couple years ago, even last year, to all of a sudden, outplacing Ferrari in the last couple GPs, or they didn't really outplace Ferrari in this GP, but they were on par with them and they did qualify better. Isaac Hadjar sliding into the top 10. He had a really good performance this race. Yuki, I think his performance was okay. His qualifying performance, obviously not great, getting knocked out of Q1 with that pretty horrific, accident into the wall after he kind of hung out his rear tire on the curb and, grabbed a little bit too much of it and lost control of the car. But, Yuki did take advantage of a lot of the situations with the VSC and the safety cars and was able to, get back up into 10th place into some points. So overall, super, super interesting race. Really, really good. Imola GP weekend, better racing than we typically see at this track. And yeah, can't wait for Monaco, which is coming up soon. So stay tuned. We will have a couple more episodes coming out this week on Imola GP. I will be doing the driver ratings, and then we will be doing an Imola F1 fashion review, and then we will be rolling into our race predictions for the next GP. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please give it a like, a share, a subscribe. Go check out my other socials, Instagram, TikTok, whatever you are on, and give it a follow, support the pod, and I will see you all next time.